in 1994. President Mandela, 1994 to 1999, revered in South Africa. There are some in some countries that don't particularly care for Nelson Mandela, but I have not met a soul in South Africa that doesn't just revere this gentleman for what he did for their country. It was a remarkable transition. It did not erupt in flames, as you might expect, when 10% minority controls in a very aggressive way 90% of the population. Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I forgive. Let's just get the truth on the table. But they have problems, and HIV/AIDS is certainly one of them. They have other problems in terms of education, skills, poverty, inequality, corruption, and crime, all probably coming from the same source. But this past summer, I took a group of teachers, 2 of whom were from Colorado, to South Africa. We got a very grand welcoming when we went to schools. This was the welcoming at one of the township schools, a very poor rural area. This is where we were being greeted. The principal addressing the entire student body for the welcoming of 12 U.S. teachers. One of our teachers from Colorado, in fact, Chatfield High School, which is where they are now, talking to small groups of students. Another teacher from Missouri. Very enthusiastic group of students. All wearing uniform, as you notice. But where do they go when they go home? When they go home to study? That's where they go. That's where they go. These are people living in the townships, and a very large percentage of the population lives in townships, a legacy associated with apartheid and discrimination. You might not see, but I'll point it out if this works. Right there, there are 3 little kids looking out the door. It's completely black inside that home. One of the most moving aspects to all of us we found here. And with that, I want to close my portion and ask our guests from South Africa. I want to tell you where they're from. There's the country. You can see the 9 provinces or the 9 states. Our guests come from 2 different provinces, although they're very close. Mapuli comes from, and you can kind of see the circle up there. I can point it out. From the Northwest Province, right there. From Rustenburg, they will have a World Cup soccer game, at least one, played there. They have a stadium in Rustenburg. And then also from the largest city where the University of Johannesburg is, and that would be Arnold, coming from Johannesburg in the state, that small yellow state of Gauteng. So without any further delay, if we can bring up that other slideshow and introduce Arnold Wenzel from the University of Johannesburg, a superb economist, a superb gentleman, someone I am proud to be a friend of, and welcome here today. Thank you. And I don't know if I've raised it high enough.
Thank you, John. Goeiemiddag, dames en heren. Het is my voorreg om hier te wees. I just greeted you in one of the 11 official languages of South Africa. Mapule will greet you in another one just now. John spoke about the social and political miracle that took place in South Africa. I'd like to speak to you about the economic miracle and some of the challenges we are still facing in this country. If you look at that graph there, you'll see where South Africa fits in the world economy if you look by GDP. South Africa is currently, I think, the 29th largest economy in the world. The US, by far the largest, producing almost 1/5 of everything produced on this planet. South Africa is closer to Australia, producing about 0.7% of everything on this planet. This makes us, although fairly insignificant compared to the US, quite significant in Africa. We are the largest economy in Africa, followed by Nigeria, Algeria, Egypt, and you can see the countries listed below. So we are kind of like the US of Africa in a way. Before 1994, as you know, you may be well aware, we had political oppression, we had sanctions against South Africa, we had US companies pulling out their investment out of South Africa, we had incomes falling, people becoming poorer, inflation, we were heading towards almost hyperinflation at some point, we had massive unemployment, human development and deficits, budget deficits, very similar to what the US is experiencing, but I think actually much worse. And the country was virtually bankrupt. In 1985, we were forced to negotiate a debt standstill with some countries, and we were virtually bankrupt. Then when the ANC, the African National Congress, under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, came to power, we instituted a number of economic reforms. These reforms were inspired by the Washington Consensus, which you may be aware of is reforms proposed by US Treasury, IMF, World Bank, all located in Washington. And this led to something called the GEAR strategy, Growth, Economic and Redistribution Strategy, which involved many things such as lower taxes, the central bank becoming independent from the government, lower tariffs, more openness to the rest of the world. And there were high expectations for economic growth and for redistribution and employment in the country. The question is, were they met? And the answer, as you will see, is kind of a yes and a no. That shows you economic growth in South Africa. Now you can see prior to 1994, economic growth was very, very unstable, and the economy was becoming very difficult to manage. Since 1994, after the elections, you can see a sustained period of economic growth, positive economic growth. The last time we had negative economic growth, well, that was in last year, 2008, but prior to 2008, the last time we had negative economic growth was 1993. So we had about 15 years of constant and consistent positive economic growth, and as you can see, that's picking up now again. The result, of course, is that before 1994, incomes were falling, as you can see there, and then since 1994, on average, the South Africans became a lot richer. We had about a 50% increase in the average income of a South African. The problem, however, was that our Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, has remained fairly constant at around 0.65. Compare that to the US with a Gini coefficient of around 0.4, 0.45. It's a country where 20% of the population earns 65% of the income, so it's highly unequal. The problem is that hasn't really improved. So we're seeing growth, higher incomes, but still most of the income going to a small group of people. As a result of the reforms, we've also seen inflation coming down. We've adopted inflation targeting and tried to keep inflation between 3 and 6%. We've been fairly successful in that. And before 1994, we had in companies withdrawing their money from South Africa, but you can see if you look at that line graph that shows you the investment coming into South Africa now. So we're becoming more open. Our current account is currently similar to the US, going into a massive deficit, but fortunately we are drawing in the investment, so it's counteracted by an increase in the surplus in the financial account. And then there was what I would call the fiscal miracle. Prior to 1994, the government's debt was 50, depending on who you listen to, between 65 and 50% of GDP. So we would virtually hand over half of our economy to pay off our government's debt. Now that's fallen substantially, as you can see there. If you look at that graph, my pointer is not working, but anyway, you can see the government debt there falling. And the result of the cause of this was because of our budget deficit being reduced, and at one point it was actually a surplus, as you will notice there. Due to the financial crisis, that's now gone into a deficit, but we are expecting to improve on that again. Now, this is quite a miracle if you bear in mind that the country had to pay off their debt to avoid going into a debt crisis, but at the same time, it had to spread some wealth to a larger majority of the population. Now, how do you do this? How do you pay off your debt and look after the rest of your population? This is the amazing thing that happened. If you look at 1994, 50 to 60% of the people in the country had access to basic services like sanitation, water, electricity. And you can see in all of those cases, housing, electricity, sanitation, water, formal dwellings, all of that has increased. So people are sharing some of the fruits of this political miracle and the social miracle. Of course, we've had our unemployment rise.